What if I told you that not every disappearance is an unsolvable mystery? That sometimes what is hidden is so terrifying that it challenges everything we believe about the world we live in? This is the true story of David, a boy full of life, who disappeared on an ordinary afternoon and came back years later with a revelation that would freeze anyone's blood. Many people believe that time heals all wounds. But what happens when time only deepens the abyss of pain and doubt? While the world tried to forget, a family lived on the eternal tightrope between hope and fear. What no one could have imagined was that David not only survived, he brought to light a truth so dark that it exposed the cruelest side of humanity, and also the most powerful demonstration of courage, wisdom, and inspiration. Get ready to dive into a story of empathy, affection, and reconciliation, but also of secret experiments, manipulation, and survival against all odds. A story that shows that the real battle is not always against visible monsters, and that sometimes survival is just the beginning of an even greater struggle. Are you ready to discover the truth that no one dared to tell? David was one of those boys who seemed to carry the sun itself in his smile. At just 8 years old, he ran through the streets of a small town where everyone still greeted each other by name. He had overflowing energy, a thirst for adventure, that lit up even the most forgotten corners of the neighborhood. It was impossible not to be enchanted by his genuine empathy, his sincere way of worrying about those who stumbled or cried. His home was simple, but overflowing with love, affection, and an atmosphere of kindness that only houses full of good stories can have. On any given afternoon, under a golden autumn sky, David went out to play in the backyard, as he did every day. But that afternoon, without a fuss, without a shout, without a goodbye, David disappeared. At first, no one panicked. After all, how often do children hide while playing, losing track of time? But as the minutes turned into hours and the sun set behind the mountains, fear grew like a living shadow. David's parents called his name in voices that oscillated between hope and insecurity. Neighbors came out of their homes, flashlights shaking in their hands, eyes scanning every dark corner. Something was wrong, something that even the town's wisdom couldn't explain. The feeling of loneliness that invaded the house that night was so dense it seemed to have weight. The yard, a silent witness to the disappearance, now carried the silence that precedes tragedies. When the news spread, it was like an electric shock running through the spine of the small community. Everyone, moved by understanding and compassion, abandoned their routines and joined in a frantic search. David's disappearance became more than a personal tragedy. It became an open wound for the entire town. It was impossible not to be moved, not to feel the sincere emotion when seeing the desperate eyes of the parents, when hearing the screams echoing in the woods and alleys. An entire town, once synonymous with tranquility, now found itself dragged into a nightmare where humanity and the power of goodness had to fight against the fear of uncertainty. And little did they know this search was only beginning. As soon as David's absence was confirmed, something was ignited in everyone's chest, a raw urgency, driven by hope, compassion, and a desperate faith in the possibility of reunion. The family, with red eyes and trembling hands, went knocking on doors. It didn't take long for neighbors, friends, and even strangers from neighboring towns to join the search. Posters with David's smiling face covered lampposts, supermarket, bulletin boards, car windshields. In every alley, in every thicket, someone called his name, summoning humanity to a final show of kindness and solidarity. It was beautiful to witness, but at the same time, painfully desperate. Investigations were opened. The police worked day and night, trying to assemble a puzzle whose pieces seemed ripped from reality. Sniffer dogs were brought in, drones flew. Over nearby forests, reporters arrived from afar. But nothing, absolutely nothing. Despair took over the town like a heavy fog, transforming every nighttime noise into a possible sign, every shadow into an invisible enemy. Amidst so much insecurity and fear, David's parents clung to an almost supernatural confidence that somehow he would return. It was as if, even in the face of chaos, love was an invisible and stubborn thread keeping them standing. As the days went by, physical exhaustion showed signs, but the emotional struggle was even more brutal. Many volunteers kept searching, even when logic told them to stop. A white-haired man, an ex-military, said to Hannah, David's mother, "As long as there is a ray of hope, the search continues." It was in these small demonstrations of wisdom and understanding that the family relied. Even when the city began, little by little, to return to its routines, because life demands, because time insists, David's parents refused to let the flame go out. And little did they know that time, that old and stubborn sculptor of stories, still had twists and turns in store that would challenge even the strongest of faiths. As the years went by, what had once been a frantic search turned into a painful, thick silence, difficult to name. Pain, that old unwanted tenant, began to take the form of routine in David's parents' house. Every corner of the house seemed to echo the absence, the bicycle leaning against the wall, the folded clothes that were never worn again, the room where time seemed forbidden to enter. Between hope and mourning, they continued to live, or rather survive, clinging to a trust that only the most genuine love can sustain. It was as if each morning was a choice between loneliness and faith in humanity, a silent battle fought deep within the heart, while the city followed its natural course. Children growing up, businesses opening and closing, parties and elections taking place, David's absence became an invisible wound for many. Little by little, the posters disappeared from the posts, the neighbors stopped talking, and the case was archived in the dusty corners of collective memory. But for Hannah and Paul, his parents, there was no forgetting. Every birthday, every special date, was lived with contained tears and silent vows of understanding and gratitude for the hope that stubbornly insisted on existing. They knew that the outside world might have forgotten, but inside that house, their hearts beat like a living promise of reunion. Their faith was a faith without proof, without clues, a true emotional adventure where the wisdom of continuing to love someone who was absent became an act of extreme courage. And believe me, few understand the weight of believing every day against all evidence. Hannah still kept the light in David's room on stormy nights like a lighthouse lost at sea. Paul, more silent, spent afternoons repairing the fence in the backyard that didn't need repair, like someone trying to keep their hands busy to keep their mind from falling apart. And little did they know that, while the city fell asleep in its routine, life was preparing a reunion as unexpected as it was breathtaking. It was a cold dawn, the kind that seems to drag time and silence even the winds. Hannah woke up with a strange start, a restlessness that she couldn't name. Little did she know that on the other side of the door, destiny was knocking literally. When Paul opened it, he found a young man, dirty, thin, with sunken eyes as if he were carrying worlds and pains inside him. The emotion was immediate, but the shock was even greater when he, with a choked voice and a look that mixed loneliness and something inexplicable, said, "My name is David ... And I know what happened." Hannah's heart stopped. It was like seeing a ghost cross the threshold, bringing with him all the unanswered questions. For several seconds, there was absolute silence. None of the three knew how to react to that broken miracle, to that emotional adventure that reopened old wounds and created new ones in a matter of seconds. The young man seemed fragile, as if a breath could knock him down, but at the same time, he carried in his eyes a contained strength, a kind of wisdom that only deep pain can teach. Hannah wanted to run and hug him, but something in the way he stepped back stopped her in her tracks. It was David. But it wasn't the David she remembered. Understanding and respect became urgent. That moment called for more than emotion. It called for care. Paul, in his restrained and practical manner, invited the young man to come in. They sat in the living room, among antique furniture and aged portraits, where time seemed to have stopped waiting for that moment. Questions boiled in the parents' eyes, but they were stifled by the kindness they had learned to cultivate over the years. David looked around as if he recognized and found everything strange at the same time. The fear, the insecurity, the courage, everything seemed to explode in the air in invisible waves. And although no one said anything for long minutes, everyone there knew, behind that return, there was an even deeper, darker story, and that sooner or later would have to be told. Even with their hearts screaming to accept, embrace, celebrate the miracle of his return, there was something about David that deeply disturbed Hannah and Paul. It wasn't just his face changed by the years. It was something deeper. Something in his eyes, in his suspicious posture, in the tense way of someone who measures each word before speaking it. Even though his empathy, affection, and desire for reconciliation were enormous, distrust was inevitable. To clear up any doubts, DNA tests were performed, and the confirmation came as a mixed punch and relief. It was him. It really was David, but the smiling 8-year-old boy was now a silent man, shaped by a reality that no one there could yet understand. With each attempt to get closer, David hesitated. He spoke little, looked sideways, avoided touching and direct questions. It was as if his every move carried invisible scars. Guided by understanding and kindness, his parents learned to respect his limits, even though their instincts screamed for immediate answers. The fear of scaring him, of making him disappear again, was real. On many nights, Hannah cried in silence, wishing she could only go back in time and hold that son, who now seemed so close and, at the same time, so unreachable. The power of kindness now required a new guise, patience and respect for David's time. What was most disturbing was the constant shadow in the young man's eyes. Something much greater than years on the streets or common experiences of abandonment. Paul, with his practical wisdom and his silent faith in humanity, tried to build bridges. He fixed objects in the house near him, started conversations about everyday life, offered trust in homeopathic doses. And little by little, very slowly, David began to release fragments, disconnected pieces of a story that promised to be as terrifying as it was salvific. It was as if each gesture of love, each demonstration of respect, were thawing an iceberg that hid something beyond what the eyes could bear. And soon, very soon, David would begin to reveal the dormant horrors he carried. The first memories emerged as disconnected flashes, shards of a broken mirror scattered throughout David's mind. At first, they came during the night, in nightmares, so intense that he would wake up gasping for breath, bathed in sweat. Little by little, between heavy silences and lost gazes, he began to share fragments with Hannah and Paul. He spoke of dark hallways, of voices whispering strange words, of locked doors that never opened. He mentioned other children, muffled cries, faces erased from memory, all trapped in a world where understanding, respect, and kindness simply did not exist. In each story, it was as if humanity lost another piece. There was something frightening in the way David described certain sensations, as if the very notion of time and space had been manipulated. He spoke of mental experiments, of cruel games that tested his physical and emotional limits. He remembered the metallic smell of the rooms, the cutting cold of the colorless walls. Each revelation was a punch in the stomach for Hannah and Paul, who needed to gather all the courage, all the wisdom, and all the love they had to not fall apart in front of their son who would suffer so much. Each new fragment torn from David's memory was a sharp knife tearing apart old certainties and a brutal reaffirmation that something much darker was hidden beyond words. Even amidst the terror of memories, David maintained the internal struggle to reconnect with what was left of himself. And that was in itself a miracle of inspiration and resistance. Each step taken out of the abyss was living proof of the power of goodness that still, somehow, resisted within him. Hannah and Paul, even crushed by the emotion, learned to be patient. They did not pressure, they just listened, offering a safe space where affection and trust could, who knows, one day flourish again. And so, between silent tears and sleepless nights, David began to piece together what would become the most terrible truth they would ever face. It took weeks for David to gather the strength to tell the truth more clearly. When he finally did, on a night when the silence seemed to weigh tons, the room turned into a confessional of horrors. He revealed that he had been kidnapped by a shadowy group, a secret organization that hunted children for cruel experiments. The idea was to mold young minds, erase memories, reprogram souls to transform them into human instruments, obedient and devoid of their own identity. Hannah and Paul listened to everything with silent tears in their eyes, feeling in each word the loneliness, fear and despair that David had carried for so long, but also recognizing in him a strength of wisdom and courage that only great souls possess. David described endless sessions of psychological manipulation, tests of physical and mental resistance, cruel strategies to break the children and mold them to the will of their tormentors. Some memories were still hazy flashes of uniforms, strange symbols, environments that seemed like something out of a nightmare, but the pain was clear in each account. The most terrifying thing was realizing that, in order to survive, he had to forget who he was, burying his own love, his own empathy, to avoid going crazy. It was as if he had erased himself to preserve the spark of life, a true inner battle where the power of goodness had to hide, protect itself in silence until escape was possible. However, not everyone was so lucky. Many of David's colleagues succumbed not only physically but mentally as well, becoming prisoners of their own programmed minds. This revelation was a brutal blow to Hannah and Paul, who needed to gather all their understanding and affection to embrace reality. Their son was a survivor, but he carried scars that would never go away. Even so, there was something indomitable in David, a silent will to fight, to transform his pain into something greater. And although there were still missing pieces in this dark puzzle, one thing was certain: the journey to expose this truth and seek justice was only just beginning. As he unearthed his memories, David could not escape a pain even sharper than that of suffering, guilt. And it was not just any guilt, it was a burden that weighed on every empty look, on every choked sigh. He revealed, with a choked voice and a lost look in his eyes, that on the night of his escape, he had to leave behind children who trusted him, friends who, like him, dreamed of returning home, but were forced to stay, victims of fear, fatigue, and manipulation. Hannah and Paul felt the weight of this revelation like a blow to their own chest, but moved by an immense understanding and compassion, they knew that, at that moment, David needed acceptance and not judgment. It was easy, for those who had never lived through hell, to say what should or should not have been done. But David, with his courageous humility, admitted his human limits. He survived because at some point, the urgency of life spoke louder than loyalty to the group. This choice haunted him, an invisible mark that he carried with his broken soul. In his mind, each face left behind was an open wound. However, even in the midst of this turmoil, there was a silent inspiration in David that, although he could not change the past, he could dedicate the future to making a difference. An act of the power of goodness that would be born of guilt, but would blossom into redemption. Hannah and Paul, with all the love and respect they learned to cultivate through pain, showed David that the most difficult forgiveness is the one we grant to ourselves. That recognizing one's own fallibility is an act of wisdom, not of weakness. That hope is not extinguished by mistakes. On the contrary, it grows when we decide to make suffering a call to transformation. And it was there, between silent hugs and bitter tears, that David began to outline a new mission for his life, to transform his remorse into strength, his pain into compassion, his story into a beacon for those who were still lost in the darkness. And this decision would lead him directly to the next step of his journey. David's decision was made in a silence filled with purpose. It was not enough to survive. He had to fight for those who were still trapped in the same nightmare he had managed to escape. Moved by the strength of hope and an unshakable sense of justice, David convinced his parents, and then the local authorities, to reopen the case. At first, they faced the disbelieving gaze of those who had become accustomed to burying difficult stories. But David's courage, his visceral sincerity, and the precision of the details he remembered, little by little, convinced even the most skeptical that there was something much bigger behind what was known. Thus began a dangerous journey, where each step required huge doses of trust, affection, and emotional resilience. David and his parents joined forces with investigators, forensic psychologists, and even investigative journalists willing to dig deeper. They searched old records, reopened forgotten complaints, followed obscure clues that led to places that reeked of fear and oblivion. Each new piece of information, each name discovered, was like pulling a thread that unraveled the web of lies built over years. The fear was real. David knew that stirring up this hornet's nest would bring risks. But he also knew that fighting for the truth was the only way to honor the memory of friends who could not escape. The journey brought to light all the complexity of human nature. People saw the best and the worst sides. Some tried to help out of pure empathy. Others, dominated by insecurity or the desire to cover up old wounds, made the path difficult. But David's determination was like a torch that would not go out. And in every sleepless night, in every doubt he faced, he remembered. The power of kindness and commitment could tear down even the oldest walls of evil. The real adventure was not only about finding the guilty. It was also about rescuing one's own soul, and who knows, creating new paths for those who were still lost in the darkness. After months of investigation, sleepless nights, and a tireless struggle, part of the truth finally came to light. Some important figures were exposed, arrested, and other victims were found, carrying the same deep scars as David. It was not a clean or complete victory. Many answers remained in the shadows, but enough to restore a little hope to those forgotten families. David, now a man with a scarred soul, understood that his journey would not end there. With the wisdom forged in pain and overcoming, he decided to dedicate his life to protecting vulnerable children. His mission was clear. No one else would go through what he went through if it depended on his courage, affection, and faith in humanity. He created an institution called Voices of Tomorrow, focused on welcoming children at risk, offering not only physical shelter, but also emotional, psychological, and educational support. He wanted to teach that true strength comes from understanding, kindness, and the power of goodness practiced daily. In the hallways of that new home, where screams of fear would once echo, laughter and dreams now flourished. Each child saved was a new page written in David's story, a story where pain was not forgotten, but transformed into fuel for real change. His inspiration did not come from wanting to be a hero, but from a visceral need to restore to life the light that they once tried to take from him. When Hannah and Paul saw him walking through those hallways, they felt a deep mixture of gratitude and pride. They knew they would never fully recover the boy they had lost, but they gained something equally powerful, a man who turned his tragedy into a seed of hope for the world. David learned that forgiveness of others and of himself was the key to not drowning in the past. His legacy was not one of pain, but of reconciliation and love. And as he looked to the future, carrying all his scars like silent medals, he knew that, deep down, this is what life is about, transforming every shadow faced into a beacon for those still walking in darkness. And now I ask you, with an open heart, how many invisible scars are there around us, hidden behind smiles, silences, or lost glances? How many stories like David's remain swallowed up by routine, haste, or indifference? His story reminds us that the power of kindness, empathy, and the courage to act are very powerful weapons against pain and injustice. Do you also carry a mission that you have left dormant, out of fear or insecurity? Isn't it time to transform your wounds into bridges, your pain into light for someone who is still lost in the darkness? Remember, every gesture of kindness, every act of genuine understanding, every choice of love over fear has the potential to change someone's destiny, and perhaps even yours. If this story touched you, if it awakened that silent flame of inspiration and desire to make a difference, then you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and come walk with us on this journey of transformation and humanity. Here, each story is an opportunity to grow, reflect, and above all, believe that the best in life is yet to come.